Hello everyone, in this lecture we're going to go through some of the challenges to the global business environment that digitalisation poses, and the intention behind this is to give a bit of context in terms of how digitalisation is affecting the global business environment and some of the challenges resulting from that. So in this lecture we're going to be discussing some definitions and development, some dimensions of technology usage, some of the different aspects of it, how it's been used, what some of the innovations are. And then we're looking at some applications of those as well. And we'll talk about some of the critiques and some of the challenges posed by these technologies. So the next 3 weeks, we're going to cover different challenges, as I've termed it, to the existing or classical business environment. This is where we're looking at 3 different really contemporary areas and seeing how they are pushing against how the global business environment has functioned for the last 50, 60, 70 years, really the kind of the post-war era or the industrial era. The first of these being digitalisation, which is today's lecture. Second being climate change, which we'll cover next week, obviously. And the final one being economic integration or disintegration. We're looking at some of those challenges there. Now, obviously, these 3 areas cover the technology, the environmental, and some of the political dimensions of the global business environment. So if we were to look back at, for instance, a pestle analysis, this is covering 3 of those different areas. So, just a bit of context, I want to put digitalisation within the broader span of how industry has developed. Mid-1760s to mid-1800s, we saw the birth of the Industrial Revolution, this period where we had the first machinery, the first manufacturing, the first industrial applications, first kind of mass production of different goods and services. And really this was led by things like the advent of steam, giving us more power than could be actually achieved through even human endeavour or using animals or using leveraging in some kind of simple way. We saw inventions like the spinning jenny as well, giving birth to easier mass-produced fabrics, which led to different developments in terms of what clothing could be, of how we could actually optimize productivity at that time. What is then termed as being the second industrial development period, or Industry 2.0, as I put it on the screen here, is the manufacturing processes being more optimized, and the advent of electricity being involved with those. This led to, or was driven by, invention of technology such as the telephone, the radio, and eventually the internal combustion engine and aeroplanes. This was all part of a span of the kind of mid to late 1800s to the mid 1930s, where we saw these different technologies starting to really take hold and lead to some really interesting innovations in terms of how we could start to put the basis for mass production in place. The classic, of course, being the Ford Motor Company and their adoption of very specialised mass production of vehicles. The third sort of wave of industrial development was really sort of epitomised by the 1970s, with mass-scale manufacturing and global supply chains being developed. These sort of big integrated supply chains that would start to feed goods and services around the world rather than being very nationally based. We started to see the birth of transnational corporations and how they sort of functioned to facilitate larger economies of scale. A lot of this was also facilitated by and led to the invention of computing and electronic systems, which were obviously birthed during the Second World War. And I think electronic systems actually led to that kind of broader development in terms of how we could actually produce at scale. That's where we sat for that kind of 70s to the 2000s. And in the 2010s, we started to talk about Industry 4.0. This idea that industry would be, from this point onwards, developed and driven by technology, higher level technology, and more importantly, digital technology. So we'd move from growth being driven by manufacturing and kind of physical processes and looking more at how digital processes start to take place and start to take hold. This is epitomised by smart devices and Internet of Things. The idea of Internet of Things is that we have little computers embedded in everything, which would enable us to track processes and practices across the world and be able to kind of optimize some of our supply chain operations. Industry 5.0 has been adopted very recently. It's first kind of mentioned in sort of 2016, I think, in a German industrial show. But the idea being that we need to try to optimize value from digital integration. So this could be through advancing AI insights into our technology uses and our data usage, or it could be, for instance, through automating and robotizing certain aspects of our economy as well. Now, I think this is still being defined, but it's also a term that is being used currently by organizations and by supranational institutions such as the EU. To help with discussing Industry 4.0 and also feeding into Industry 5.0, the International Standards Organization has put together this kind of a whole report, which I've linked in the notes, and also linked together two different IECs, International Electrical kind of standards, which actually talk about how the different aspects of Industry 4.0 overlap and integrate with each other. This idea that we have an integrated coherency to the data that's been used, so we're able to understand more and transfer insights across data sets and across organizations. Because the problem with older versions of technology and older older contexts was they're very siloed. What we're looking at here to really get the most from Industry 5.0 and 4.0, these kind of more digitally integrated and value-based systems, is we need to have some kind of interoperability between systems. Now, this, of course, poses some significant challenges and some real changes to how the world could work. And one of the aspects of globalization we discussed was tax residency. You know, where do companies, where do multinationals pay their taxes? What are the implications of that? And if we're sort of talking about services now being available all over the world and provided by multinationals, and more importantly, services themselves being very flexible and able to sort of move around, then where should we look at taxes being paid? What does it mean as well for the laws that are applicable to companies that are providing services globally? If we're saying laws are geographically boundaried by the country that sets them, then does me buying services from a company in China, for instance, should I be adhering to the laws in the UK or the laws in China? Now, at the moment, I should be adhering to the laws in the UK because this is the point at which I'm consuming it. But where am I consuming it? You know, am I consuming it actually in China? So that kind of topic is starting to become more and more discussed. And as a result, we need to think about how governments can challenge large multinational corporations that are not selling tangible items anymore. They're selling intangible services and digital goods. And that's really different to that's a 1970s multinational corporation supply chain perspective, because now we can't really touch these things. We can't really kind of stop something I'm purchasing at the border and say, I want to apply a tariff or a tax to this, because actually it's been transferred digitally. There are organisations such as the EU who are pushing back against this. And there's been a recent Court of Justice of the European Union clarification on how social media companies can use data which has been scraped from EU citizens, or collected from EU citizens. The idea being that actually it's taking something of value from EU citizens, transferring it overseas for processing, perhaps in California in this instance, in Facebook's instance, and then being used for other purposes there. So it's a great example of how actually governments, individual nation states, are having to look towards international structures and institutions such as the EU to help push back against multinational corporations, because an individual nation state on its own hasn't got the capacity to do that. Now, one aspect linked to the previous point is that data-driven decisions are more and more and more important, and I think that's one of the key changes. If companies are able to make data-driven decisions, they're able to make better decisions. They're able to look at the actual empirical information and make a decision based upon that, rather than what people think. If anyone's ever seen the TV show Mad Men, they'll know that the advertising executives in Mad Men used to just make decisions about what they thought was the right thing to do. They used to tap into the zeitgeist as they saw it, rather than understanding what it actually was by measuring it. Of course, profiling has been one of those things that's been commonly used in marketing and in kind of sales and in data analysis as well, whereby you'd make a kind of proxy, a profile of an individual. And that kind of profiling process is covered by the Data Protection Act in the UK. So the data that you provide to companies to put together into some kind of amalgam of a profile that is you or is emblematic of you is protected and covered by legislation in the UK. But again, it comes back to that discussion of how does that interact with multinationalism. All of this processing of data and this kind of profiling leads to some companies being able to make decisions which are completely automatic. And an example of that would be Lloyds Bank. I've put a link here on the screen which takes you through to Lloyds Bank saying how they use profiles of customer data, how they use your data to make decisions. If you are a customer of theirs, they make decisions about you automatically using your data. So for instance, they might turn down a credit application for a credit card or a mortgage automatically because they've looked at your data and decided that actually, despite whatever arguments you might have about an insurance claim, it's not applicable. Many data-driven decisions are being used to understand the demand and supply dynamics for organizations. Because if we can more easily estimate demand for a product, we can more easily estimate the amount we need to actually produce or the price we need to produce it at. And this can be done in real time in some instances as well. So there are plenty of products which are actually developed based upon search results to understand whether or not there is demand for that product initially. One of the aspects that has undermined Kickstarter and crowdsourcing and crowdfunding of different product development has been the fact that there's more and more evidence available regarding market research and understanding demand for products initially than there was before. So 10 years ago, when crowdfunding was a big deal, people were trying to speculatively understand whether or not there was a market for a product by saying, I will make it if I hit so much support for it. Now, many companies are just saying, well, actually, I know what the demand is for the product that I'm proposing to sell to you because I've seen the market data. Amazon's a great example of this. They're working using different AI systems to understand at a very granular level exactly what the demand is for certain products. They're then sourcing those products and supplying them through Amazon searches up front and ahead in some instances of other products they already sell and other competitors. Data-driven sales are very interesting as well in terms of how sales operations within businesses are now operating. So companies can scrape data, collect it from a range of different sources to develop leads and understand what their competitors are like. This kind of process is quite easy to do, and it's something that you guys could practice doing as well. And a great example of how this works in practice was a recent discussion I had with Siemens, the big electrical company. And they said that within 12 minutes of receiving a request for quotation, i.e. a request to their business, they can have that request distributed to all different departments and actually be starting to work on that request. So they're ahead of all of their competitors because they're already understanding and distributing the request to their business. They can look around the internet and collect opportunities and leads and distribute that through their systems ahead of everyone else, giving them a real competitive advantage. It's really interesting to see something like ASOS as well. ASOS, Zara, H&M, some of these big companies are getting really, really good at using AI to identify different trends on social media and then sourcing products or making products which actually facilitate those demand trends. So ASOS, for instance, has just partnered with Microsoft to look at how they can actually use AI to support this kind of developmental process and really optimize that turnaround from not even catwalk, pre-catwalk, that kind of identifying a trend that might have end up on a catwalk, and actually make fashion products which serve that need ahead of time. I think it's really interesting. I looked around for some information about who the real leaders and laggards are in this world. And looking at the Institute for Data Analytics, I kind of came across quite a good graph here in terms of looking at the capacity for different countries indexed to 100. USA being far and away the leader, Netherlands being second and Singapore third. Netherlands second is of course because there's lots of focus of industrial production and manufacturing within Europe there. China down at 19 and the UK at 20 because while we are highly developed economies, we're not particularly advanced in terms of the level of digital integration, level of usage of digital information that we are actually making use of. So I think it's interesting to see the relative competitiveness of different economies in from this kind of context. Some of those countries you expect to be at the bottom are, of course, at the bottom, and there's a real challenge in terms of how some of these digital laggards, these countries that are laying behind in terms of digital infrastructure and digital capacity, can actually make an advance up the table. Let's just talk a little bit about factors of production. So one of the first things talked about in the module was this idea about there being 4 factors of production. So we talked about land, labour, capital and intellectual property. Let's reverse that a little bit. The biggest change here is regarding enterprise or intellectual property. It's fundamentally changed because now it becomes global. It's become something that is no longer geographically bounded. There's not one entrepreneur in Leeds who decides to do something and makes some new process which cannot be seen by anyone else unless they come to his factory. Instead, in the kind of digital innovation space, they may be already cloud sourcing it. It may be fundamentally shared initially. It might be seen at a conference. It might be exposed globally very, very quickly. This, of course, leads us to challenges regarding protecting that intellectual property. How do we protect the patents behind that? How do we protect and let that idea grow before it has global exposure? Secondly, of course, in a kind of digital kind of working world, labour is sourceable globally, and you can get kind of sources of labour from wherever there is an internet connection. The radio show I've posted on the module page is really good to listen to in terms of the discussion around tech workers and what the reality of that might be for some people who work in the tech industry. What are land and raw materials in this context? Now, I think that's interesting to talk about, but it's really about infrastructure, and it's about that kind of the raw materials kind of going into it. The server bandwidth, the storage, the raw kind of capacity of different production, which is fed into the systems here, which is in this context, yeah, it's server farms, it's CPUs, it's chips, that's why companies like Nvidia are now top ranked in the world globally for their, in terms of their stock price and their market capitalization. Which brings us, of course, to capital, which is utilizable globally. We can draw upon global sources of capital, including things like digital infrastructure, to actually facilitate the work that's been undertaken. So I think this is a really interesting way to look at how the fundamental factors of production have been changed by digitalization. I want to talk a little bit about smart manufacturing, what that is. So the Internet of Things was a term that was coined about sort of 10, 15 years ago. And it referred to this idea that we could have internet-enabled technology embedded into everyday items at some level, most kind of typified by things like smart fridges or smart kettles or smart ovens or whatever. What it really means is, though, in a real context now, is that Smart devices have been embedded in manufacturing processes, and that enables manufacturing processes to be optimized. So in the second year of your degree, you'll probably be looking at operations management, looking at things like process charts and flow charts of different organizations. We can optimize many of these different processes by understanding better what's happening to goods and services as they pass through a manufacturing plant. For instance, the reason we're able to know when our Amazon package is going to be delivered is because actually Amazon track where it is all the time within their supply chain. Some cases, machinery can actually report itself that it is failing. They can report there's a problem with itself, and they can wave a little red flag for an engineer to come out and fix them. A great example of that is the one I've put on the screen here, which is the McDonald's ice cream machines, and they report directly to McDonald's that they have a problem. There's been a recent court case in America where the McDonald's franchisees, the people who run the actual restaurants, have been complaining that McDonald's head office are not responding quickly enough to fix these machines, so they want to do it themselves. As a result of that, the McBroken website is using this newly opened protocol to understand where the working ice cream machines at McDonald's are available. In the live lecture, I'll be showing this and having a look at whether or not we can get a McFlurry in Leeds or not. So digitalisation offers many different data handling opportunities as well, and it offers real benefits for compliance in terms of how we deal with goods and services passing through more traditional supply chains rather than just the digital world. So for instance, in the more traditional manufacturing processes, there may be communication methods which are quite slow. We may have issues regarding transmission as well. A great example in the news this week was the fact that the NHS is the biggest purchaser of fax machines in the UK. They still use fax machines in 2024 for many of the different communications they need to make from point to point and around the organisation. Now, of course, there are opportunities here for therefore having verified communication techniques and verified technologies like verifiable technologies like blockchain. Blockchain can have verification of transmission and receipts included. It can have verification digitally and at cryptographic level of the content that's been included in the communication to make sure it's just it is legit. An example would be if somebody wrote to you and said, "Here's my patient records. How do you know those are true? How as a doctor would I know if these patient records are actually accurate?" Well, if it's cryptographically digitally signed, I would absolutely know that it's come from an authentic source, and I can therefore have confidence that it is the document I requested, information is correct within it as well. This means that for supply chains, the bill of lading, which is the document which says what is in a container, that document can be digitally and cryptographically signed, and therefore anybody looking at that container, if it's got a digital bill of lading associated with it, can be comfortable that that is what is actually in that consignment. Great examples have been case studied from things like pharmaceuticals and healthcare, of course. Pharmaceuticals need to make sure they have absolutely verifiable end-to-end understanding of what is in a product that they've produced, and having some kind of blockchain or cryptographic verification of the specification of an item is a real boon and a real critical advantage. A little bit about digitalisation in practice that we might all see day to day. Apps in restaurants. So wrapping up all the things we talked about. Apps in restaurants, personally I hate them, but some people really like them. And Nando's is one that's really popular. I've got that app at some point on my phone as well. It facilitates order speed. We don't need to have somebody come over to our table and take our order. We can look at leisure at the menu. We can look at how the menu is changing over time. Perhaps they might have had to withdraw something from the menu and it's not been scribbled out on a paper copy, but on the app, it's automatically updated. There's less labour required to hang around and take my order and get confused. The order should be more correct because I've chosen the thing I wanted on the app. Splitting the bill becomes a lot easier because if everyone's got the app, everyone can order the thing they want to table 24 or wherever it's going to go to, or we can just automatically split the bill. We can do that in apps like PayPal or Monzo as well. They both facilitate splitting the bill, and it becomes very easy to actually have a group of people go to a restaurant together. There are some problems with this. For instance, the questions regarding allergies need to be built into apps, and some people don't feel very comfortable if they have extreme allergies, for instance, nut allergies. They don't feel very comfortable that maybe an app can communicate it as effectively and as seriously as it needs to, although these have been obviously built into the apps themselves, so that's been addressed. What could be the end game? Well, I think I found this robot bar in Las Vegas where the bar itself automatically makes your drink for you. There's nobody there to kind of talk to. You just go to a screen or you go to use the app in the bar and you can order what you want and it gives it to your station. Maybe that's an end game. I think that's probably a bit extreme, but certainly these kind of apps in restaurants are incredibly popular. Okay, so on the module page, there's a couple of different readings there and different things to look at. The essential reading really for this week is going to be the McKinsey report on digitalisation. That focuses on supply chains, but it's a really great example of how digitalisation is affecting broader industry. And again, really challenging some of the concepts and principles of the post-war mass industrial model. A good optional reading would be the chapter 3 from the OECD report that I put on there. The full report's 160 pages. Chapter 3 looks at data and digitalisation, and it's a really useful overview of where different industries and different agreements are at the moment. Finally then, there's a great BBC radio programme I put on there which is about tech workers and what some implications are for people. And again, it feeds back into the discussion I had earlier on about the factors of production. I think that'd be really interesting for you. So in conclusion, I think it's a really dynamic process and it's been going on for centuries. This kind of idea of technology development facilitating different models of business and different models of the economy. I think it's worthwhile being trying to take that long view, but also engaging with the basic principles of what's changing. And if we're thinking that way, we can see that it's about productivity, it's about production styles, it's about growth, and it's about the raw economic underpinning fundamentals that are being affected. Try less to think about the sort of faddy day-to-day AI is going to change things. Think more about how that might factor into a broader global business environment change. It's the latest step in terms of using data to make empirical decisions and making decisions in a reasonable fashion based upon objective information about the business world around us. Okay, thank you.